We're continuing with Chapter 34 of Barry and the Boys, the CIA, the Mob, and America's Secret History by Daniel Hopsicker. Trinity is my name too. Sifting through the discarded shells of dummy corporations in the musty basement of the Louisiana Secretary of State's office, one can find a treasure trove of conspiracy lore, writ small in the dusty language of incorporation documents. We came across evidence there of the sheer effort expanded in the gargantuan efforts of laundering the proceeds of the drug trade. Clearly, it is an enterprise requiring the services of vast bevies of lawyers like Michael Roy Fugler. We were there seeking to learn more about the multi-million-dollar investment of Barry Seal's drug cash that had infused an oil and gas company named Trinity Energy, which Fugler had in 1995 been selling to his Miami and Budapest-based friends. There we found records of the incorporation of Trinity Oil and Gas in September of 1982, the same month that Barry Seal's MENA operation had swung into high gear. The listed officers were Dewey Brister Jr., a trustworthy Calvin Briggs, the Barry Seal employee that didn't mind doing time for another man's crime. There was, in addition, a Trinity Securities with Calvin Briggs' name on it as well. Briggs, recall, was the trusted Seal associate who had taken the fall when Emily Camp was busted in Miami. With a trunk full of counterfeit quaaludes, and had then falsely identified himself as Briggs. It made sense that Barry Seal would use as a cutout in a money laundering deal someone like Briggs, whom he knew he could trust. When we went looking for Calvin Briggs, we learned that he's dead. Louisiana law enforcement authorities said that Briggs was dead, a suicide in the mid-'80s, but Barry Seal's widow, Debbie, told us of bumping into him and having lunch 5 years after his supposed demise. Go figure. If Briggs were dead, he'd be difficult to locate, but if he had merely switched identities, he'd be impossible to find, we figured. So we turned our attention to the other listed officer in Trinity, Dewey Brister, today a financial planner with Payne Weber in Baton Rouge. Needless to say, these are matters Dewey would prefer rested comfortably in the past. We asked him about the qualifications of his partner in their joint oil-running venture. Calvin Briggs was dumber than a shithouse brick, heavily tattooed, your typical biker with bars and scars, a Louisiana State Police source had told us. Had Brister found Briggs to be had Brister found Briggs to be a bit unlikely in the role of oil wildcatter? Brister didn't flinch, but he did grow nervous, stating that he had no knowledge at all of Calvin Briggs was an associate of notorious drug smuggler Barry Seal, but had just been referred to him by a banker friend of his. The attorney who'd put together the deal, Andrew Ezell, didn't flinch either. Maybe they'd talked. No, it didn't strike me as strange at all when Dewey came into my office with a biker looting guy and said they were setting up an oil company. Ezell Avers, it's what I do. Our first venture raised only $30,000 to $40,000. We drilled some in '83, Brister stated, and hit nothing to speak of. And that was the end of it. What about Trinity Securities? How had that come about? My attorney Andrew Azell was a securities lawyer who told me that incorporating a securities company would help us avoid any SEC problems in limited offerings, Brister said. I was trying to do everything by the letter of the law, and you need a guy like Andy Azell to do it. After I got out of the drilling venture, I gave back the securities company to Azell. Andy Azell had been LSU's quarterback while SEAL attorney Royal Fugler, Blackie, and Joseph Beaver Brantley IV were in law school there, we learned. When we met him for breakfast one crisp fall New Orleans morning, at what we were told later was a mob-owned hangout, he was wearing a sleeveless white sweater and the casual air of a Rotarian from some place where all the news doesn't make the papers. Like Brister, Azell seemed eager to deflect attention in other directions, and began positively waxing philosophical when we mentioned the name Beaver Brantley, who we knew to be involved with Louisiana Governor Edwards' son Stephen in a Texas energy company that came up missing over $100 million. Beaver Brantley is the kind of guy who would call around town during the time we're talking about, the early 80s, and mention breathlessly that he had 300,000 barrels of Arabian light crude, a very desirable grade of oil, sitting on a tanker that he could let you have at a great price if you could do business right away, said Azell. Was Brantley connected? Everything in this state is pretty tied in, Azell said. It's all of a piece. What do you think killed Kennedy? Brister and Azell both stated that there was no possible way that Trinity Oil and Gas and Trinity Securities they had been involved with could have possibly been the company sold by SEAL attorney Michael Roy Fugler in 1995 for $22 million. It wasn't worth a tenth of that, they both said. We went back to the Secretary of State's office for another afternoon, wading in the big muddy water of Louisiana Corporation archives, where before our disbelieving eyes an elaborate charade began to slowly reveal itself. Before we were finished, we had discovered the whole gaggle of seemingly connected Trinity Oils and Trinity Energies. Which one led back to drug money laundering and Barry Seal? Maybe all of them. It's the name game, explained Luis Batuello, a financial investor in California's Napa Valley who's been tracking Iran-Contra-linked fraud for a decade. The name Trinity is a code, like wearing a Mason's ring, something which only initiates understand. And if that's not complicated enough for you already, it's intimately related to another code name, Triad. Look in the dictionary. Triad. And number 1, a union or group of 3, especially of 3 closely related persons being or things a trinity. Remember Neil Bush and Silverado Savings and Loan? She continued, Silverado was a similar code which was used by dozens of corporate entities running through numerous subsidiaries, the sub-operations of Iran-Contra. Told that Silverado Mining had been purchased by Jack Bernholt's Miami fund and said, you have to understand that the name Trinity, like Silverado, was a code name, a variation of Triad, which equals Trinity. She pointed to us The Bluegrass Conspiracy by Sally Denton, 1990 Doubleday, where the major smuggler profiled in the book had a horse farm located just outside Lexington, Kentucky, named Triad. Triad had been owned by a man named Drew Thornton, whose body had been found outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. He had fallen or jumped from a plane following a chase by DEA planes, and his parachute failed to open. On his body was $75 million in cocaine, as well as night vision goggles like Barry Seal's pilots used. Denton wrote, "A sign on the fence surrounding the property reads, 'Notice, trespassing on this property may be hazardous to your health.' The word triad was painted on a sign at the entrance to the farm. Other federal agencies had also been enticed by rumors of arms stockpiling and mercenary training at Triad. U.S. Customs agents in New York who were monitoring the activities of Adnan Khashoggi, familiar name, the man who was cut up by the Saudis for being a spy not too long ago? Adnan Khashoggi briefly entertained the possibility that Triad was a subsidiary of Khashoggi's Triad American Corporation. The fact that Khashoggi was frequenting Lexington added fuel to the speculation. She wrote, "In Bluegrass Conspiracy, coincidentally, Ralph Ross had suddenly been receiving complaints about suspicious activity on Triad. Neighbors had reported to state police that a cult of devil worshippers frequented the remote property, and that the constant firing of automatic weapons could be heard. Dozens of people wearing military camouflage uniforms were seen rappelling from the black cliffs of Triad. You'll find that these relationships go to Governor John Y. Brown of Kentucky, and that Bill Clinton was also in the loop," one observer told us. "And they go to Dan Lassiter as well, since researchers have known for some time that Triad was a code. It doesn't surprise me that you're turning up company fronts named Trinity." Drew Thornton had CIA phone numbers in his wallet too when he died, just like Barry Seal, and according to the Bluegrass Conspiracy, Thornton was also a close associate of Jimmy Lambert, the man who gave Arkansas's Bond Daddy and Clinton best friend Dan Lassiter his first hit of cocaine. Most Trinities and most Triads in the SEC system start out as limited partnerships, then become limited liability companies, Luis Batuelo told us, which then become investors in another company, which then goes public. This is the payoff system of upward flips with profits made at each level. Then we found a Trinity Energy, which was founded by a man, Dale Wamstad, who quickly confessed to us having been an associate of the company principal and kingpin Jimmy Lambert. Owning Trinity Energy is only one we were to discover of Dale Wamstad's claims to fame. Bit of a short chapter.